Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are here for DeployStudio, more tips, tricks, and discussions, hopefully, to incentivize this a little bit. Now, to be honest, this is a bigger turnout as I was expecting, so I don't have a whole lot, but I have magnets. So, while I don't know if I can attach them to this nifty little catch box thing here to throw at your head, I do have magnets, so I will try to do it. Those who participate come first, and then after that I've got a small stack. I only ordered 50 of them, and there's clearly more than 50 of you here. So there's that. So I am Nathan Felton. Wow, that's kind of dim up there. But I'm a senior PC sysadmin at the Rochester Institute of Technology. I am what I self-title myself as a dual platform PC sysadmin, and that just means that I not only get to deal with Macs all day, but also the realm of Windows and occasionally a Linux server. So I'm sure most of you nodding your heads are in the same boat. So DeployStudio, as I'm sure many of you know, help in that realm because when you're dealing with WDS or SCCM on the Windows side, DeployStudio helps you quickly get up and running with similar tasks on the Mac side. So I do want to do a quick show of hands. How many people are brand new to DeployStudio and are here to learn some things about it? Good? Okay, that's a good number. Now, here's the important question of how many people have come to one of my presentations before? Okay, you guys are in for an interesting discussion then. Oh, I don't get the view up here. Okay. As a update to those who have come to my previous sessions, about a little over 3 years ago, I had a daughter gifted upon me, and here's a status update of where she is. So I've got her geeked out in the Apple shirt. So, what's that? Yeah, it definitely wasn't me. So one of the interesting things that we were talking a little bit before the session about DeployStudio is this is my 5th presentation on DeployStudio, and I like to semi-joke that this is the slide of new features since 5 years ago. So not a whole lot has changed in DeployStudio. So we do love that they've at least helped with some compatibility updates through the ages. But the writing's been on the wall for a while that it might not be around much longer, especially with some of the OS 10 changes that are coming through the pipe. So, as such, because the presentation hasn't really changed much in the last 5 years, this is kind of my second joke of I'm just going to come sit with you and instead just play one of my previous conferences on YouTube, which, of course, the Wi-Fi isn't helping with right now. There we go. So you guys get to sit here and just watch this. So that's that joke. Here's the agenda. Again, if you've done one of my presentations before, especially last year, this will look very familiar. Hopefully I can bring out a little more in it this year. Kind of what I've tried to do is take a lot of the same topics, but add a bit more automation to it. So having said that, if a lot of this seems familiar and you're not really interested in going through it again, feel free to leave. I won't be offended. But we're going to go a little bit through the hidden API that DeployStudio itself uses. And for a couple of these different items, I've gone through and tried to make those steps better or those suggestions better by using the API. Right now, none of the code is available, but my hope is to, by the end of this week, to post it all in a blog post and put it all up on GitHub so that you guys can see what I've done. Then we'll get to that. So the API, it is a basic RESTful-like API. Special thanks to Tim Sutton for saving me a lot of time because if you actually do a Google for DeployStudio API, he actually is a higher hit than any of the DeployStudio forum posts at this point. So Tim helped out a lot in me not having to write any new code. But if you're at all familiar with RESTful APIs, there's basic HTTP authentication for this one with get and post endpoints. And it's just your typical URL to DeployStudio, whether or not you're using SSL or not. These are a couple of the noteworthy API endpoints that you can use. There's a couple that I'll touch on through here. Get computers, get all computers, computers get all, however you want to read it, I guess. Allows you to pull in all the computers that are currently in your database and kind of manipulate the data after the fact. I'm not going to go through each one, but you kind of get an idea of if you give it an identifier, you're looking for that specific item in your DeployStudio database. If you're getting all, obviously you're getting a large dump of whatever it is, be it a computer or a workflow object. And then post is similar. You can set information on an entry in your database by giving it the ID in the database, which typically the ID is just a UUID within DeployStudio. This is kind of an example of the input, or the output, I'm sorry, that you would get from get computers all. This is just one section or one computer in the database. You'll notice that the key for this item in the P list here is actually the same as your serial number here. And that is important and depends on, most people these days are using serial number as the primary identifier for their DeployStudio environment because of the wonderful Thunderbolt to Ethernet or USB to Ethernet dongles. Using serial number helps you be able to reuse those dongles. So some key information here. There's architecture, i386. That's basically, DeployStudio had the support for PowerPC at one point, so that's a key identifier. Tells you the model identifier, tells you the primary key that we're using is serial number. Again, the serial number, we're saying that it's a Mac because, again, DeployStudio had support at one point for PCs. If we move up a little bit. Did
it officially get removed, or did they just...
No, my understanding of it is there is no longer DeployStudio for PC. The whole Pixie boot version of DeployStudio for Windows machines, if you will, is no longer developed. So that's another thing that's the writing on the wall, is their product offerings, if you will, has shrunk over time. Some more information is the last workflow that machine ran, the time that it took to run, the duration that it took to run that workflow, and when it was run, whether or not it completed successfully or not, and the MAC address that was recorded at the last runtime. So the reason I show you all this is one of my hopes is that there's a potential for expanding other tools, if you will, using some of this API information. I've been on the fence as to whether or not I wanted to spend the time on it because, as we all kind of know, we don't know if DeployStudio will be around much longer. One of the key things I'm thinking about, though, is Monkey Report PHP. You could build a module or plugin, whatever they call it, to Monkey Report PHP using a lot of this information so that when you look up a computer in that inventory system, if you will, you can have a tab for DeployStudio and see a lot of this information. So a good way to tie different APIs together is you can pull in a computer object. You can look at this last workflow that was ran. You can then pull in all of your workflow objects and get the title of what was ran. So that's why APIs are so powerful, is you can take multiple endpoints and multiple points of data and tie them all together, kind of like a SQL query, if you will, and get the data that you want. So that would be a good way to kind of get a single pane of glass of what's going on in your environment, especially if you have technicians running workflows for you and whatnot. This would be a potential opportunity to look up the computer in one location and see what's been going on with it from a monkey standpoint, from a DeployStudio standpoint, from insert tool here. When when posting data into the DeployStudio API, there are two required keys. You need to tell it that you're using the serial number as your primary key, and then of course give it the actual serial number. Without those two pieces of information, trust me, I've tried a couple different permutations. Without those two pieces of information, nothing shows up in the database. There are optional but extremely useful keys, which I'll show in a minute here. Again, the architecture type, the computer name, the identifier of the computer, the host type, again being a Mac, not a PC, the host name, which is slightly different than the computer name, and then of course the MAC address. So here's a quick demo of me running some things with the API. You can see that I currently have no computers in my database. I run a quick Python script against the API that builds some test computers for me. But you'll notice that after I refresh, there's not a whole lot of prettiness, if you will. It thinks it's a PC. It doesn't know the host name. It thinks it's a Windows machine here. Oop. So I ran another script that uses those optional but useful keys. And after doing that, and again refreshing DeployStudio, a lot more useful information comes in. So the model identifier is used to give it a nice pretty icon. We know that it's an Intel-based i386 Mac, not a PowerPC. And you can also see that my host names and my computer names are fully populated. So just a quick example of using the API. You can, for me, this would have been a lot helpful in the past, but if you're ever doing a lot of testing with DeployStudio, these scripts may help because you can quickly blow away your environment and run a script, and in 10 seconds or less, you have kind of a whole suite of workflows or computers to help you do testing with. So next is workflow organization. Again, if you've been to this presentation, you've seen this a couple times, but for the new people, this is something that I came up with, again, like 5 years ago, that helps me keep things organized. And this is extremely important for if you have techs, if you have people that aren't you trying to run your workflows. This helps keep it organized in their mind. This was also extremely useful back when they didn't have that little publish checkmark. Most of you that are new to DeployStudio won't know this, but the column on the far right that says published so that you can actually see the workflows in the runtime didn't used to exist. So this was a way that when you had to show all of the workflows, it was a way to be able to organize them. Using workflow organization, it's easier to take documentation, take screenshots, and to be able to train your technicians because you can tell them certain workflow identifiers or workflow IDs or titles, if you will, without having to say, oh, browse halfway down and find the one that restores Mountain Lion. Well, El Capitan. Update a little bit. The workflow numbering allows for keyboard selection. So if you have still have a Mac these days with a numpad, it makes it a lot easier, which again, you'll see in a second. And it helps keep sanity with multiple admins. Again, if you have more than one person with their hands in the pot, it helps keep sanity because you're both on the same page of where things should belong versus you thinking it should be done one way and they think it should be done another way. If you come into a common consensus and organization, it helps both of you stay sane. And it's recommended with fresh installs or production cleanup. And one of the things I will hopefully show you is that, especially with the API, it's much faster and easier now to implement these organization tips after the fact. So after you already have a whole bunch of workflows already built, you can kind of play catch up and get the organization after the fact a lot easier. So these are the default workflows at a default install of DeployStudio. Kind of messy, and I mean, just taking a quick look, you don't know which one you should probably use. So think if you just hire a brand new technician to go out and reimage a machine, if you have names like this, it's not at a glance easy to say, well, I need to do restore master on volume. If you would think if one of the primary things you're doing with DeployStudio, you're going to want that more at the top so that they're not searching for it and accidentally clicking something like create a master or triple OS restoration, or if you're someone like me who has a workflow that debans and wipes the machine, you don't want them accidentally clicking that. So again, workflow organization can help with preventing problems like that. Many of you may have workflows like this now where there's not a whole lot of organization. You just see restore, 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 and it gets kind of messy, and eventually you end up with a ton of workflows that just kind of keep scrolling on. So again, you don't really want your text to have to be scrolling through this long list to try and find the workflow they're supposed to be running. So these are the workflow groups that I recommend. It helps you kind of organize. It's kind of the missing feature, if you will, from the workflow tab in DeployStudio. Allows you to group workflows together in kind of a meta grouping of whatever you'd like. These are just the ones that I recommend. They're kind of out of date now a little bit. I don't really use dual boot as much anymore. And a lot of people are using third-party tools now to do the post configuration and whatnot of their machines after DeployStudio lays down the image. But this is what I came up with. And this is kind of an idea of how you can organize things after you get the groupings created. So what I tend to do is, I'll show this off a bit more later, but I have a universal reimage that does some background scripting ideas so that instead of you having to tell the tech, try to put down LCAP, but then you find out that the computer they're trying to put it on for whatever reason doesn't meet the requirements, you're going to run into issues. Whereas if you run this with the script in the background, I have it pre-loaded with model identifiers and RAM checks and hard drive space checks and things like that so that it'll only let you run the latest OS. But it also took out the guesswork of saying, well, what is the latest OS for this hardware? You just run this one universal reimage, and it figures it out for you. But you can also see here that I have the different OS versions, 10.9, 10.10, and 10.11. Their matching identifier, if you will, at the beginning, it matches their OS number. So again, it kind of helps give you a visual of and knowing of what you're actually doing. So if you want to say, well, I know this machine can go to LCAP, but I want to put Yosemite on it, then you can more easily see that's 10.10. That also helps with by starting with a number, that's where the numpad comes in. So now your tech can come in and say, well, I need 10.10. They can, 10.10 on the keyboard, and it'll automatically drop to that item. Quick demo, again, using the API. You can see I have the 4 normal default workflows that come with DeployStudio. Quick Python script into the API, refresh the workflows, and boom, I have the 9 groups, if you will, already built for me. After that, you can go in and if you already have workflows that exist, you can start giving them different numbers, and that'll start jumping them into those workflow groups so that they're organized and so that, again, people can start using their number identifier to quickly find them with the keypad. Which brings us to nested workflows. One of the key things that I always try to tout is automation, and that is kind of what DeployStudio is supposed to be about. If you further that along with the API, that kind of furthers your automating of your automation. So nested workflows, though, are kind of the built-in method of DeployStudio to allow for better automation and less, we'll go with less maintenance in DeployStudio, and I'll show you why. You use the workflow task in DeployStudio, and it allows for either static or dynamic workflows via scripts. So what that means is if you use the workflow task item, you can just embed a static workflow so that you always know that when you run this workflow that it always calls this other workflow no matter what. It's static, it doesn't change. The other option, though, is dynamic workflows, and that uses a keyword that you can output in the DeployStudio runtime to change the workflow that you use. So in this case, you can echo out runtime select workflow and then give it an identifier, and that identifier can either be a UUID of the workflow or it can be the title of the workflow. Now, if you're like me, you may have to go through and change your title from time to time to make it more user-friendly. So my recommendation is to try and always use the UUID. You'll notice in the DeployStudio workflow, that you can actually see the identifier, and if you just double click on that, it'll allow you to highlight and copy that identifier right out of DeployStudio, making it easier to modify your scripts and use the UUID of the workflow rather than the title. This is just a quick script. This is actually mostly a demo script from DeployStudio. It's simply getting your machine model, which is something like MacBook Air 3.2, which is quite old and I should update that, and basically says, if you are this model, then go ahead and run this workflow. That becomes very powerful, again, with the universal script that I run. You can go in there and basically say, if you match all of this criteria, then you run this workflow, is essentially one of the things it's doing. This is an example of the nested workflow and using a script to return the workflow you want to use. So return by script, DS workflow selector. In workflow selector, you just need to make sure that your option that you want is echoed out during runtime. Eric Gomez gave me permission to speak about this, so thank you, Eric. He wrote some DeployStudio scripts based on one of my previous sessions when he found out that you can use this dynamic workflow selector. So what he actually did is he took it a step further beyond what I even did, which is to give the users a GUI. So I have a quick demo of that. No, I don't. Oh, I clicked instead of. Let's try not to click on the link. There we go. So here, I'll run my Universal OS 10 repackage or reimage, but instead of it doing the logic for me in the background and just selecting the appropriate workflow, now you get a quick little GUI, and you can select which OS you want, and it'll kick off the workflow that would start installing LCAP. So just a quick demo. It doesn't actually do anything but tell you you're installing LCAP at 10. Computer groups are another way to help with automation. They allow you to organize the workstations, but they also allow you to bulk modify certain settings on all of the computers within the group. It allows you to set a default group for new machines that have never been added to the DeployStudio database. It allows you to assign workflows so that if you have a computer lab, for example, then you can go in and say, every computer in this lab, run this workflow the next time you netboot, the next time you run the runtime. It allows you to organize them just for visual purposes, and again, it allows you to bulk apply properties. But there are some things that the GUI doesn't have, and I'll show you that in a minute, but that's where the API can be helpful again, is things that the GUI can't do in bulk using groups, you can use the API for instead. So here's an example of using the default group. We have a group called restart, and essentially anytime a computer talks to DeployStudio for the first time, it runs a workflow called reboot, and it just means that it allows you to get the computer into the DeployStudio database, but it also is a prevention method so that if a faculty member, for whatever reason, suddenly netboots and is able to log into DeployStudio for whatever reason, it's kind of a safety measure that it just kicks them right back out. It reboots them back out, and hopefully at that time it'll boot into the OS. So we've only had one incident where someone almost re-imaged their machine on accident. So something I don't have in the slides, but I'll mention, is we do two styles of netboot sets. The first style is primarily there's no auto login to our netboot set, and that helps prevent people from re-imaging the machines that shouldn't be. And our second one for the computer labs does auto login so that you don't have to go log into 35 machines when you want to re-image the lab. The difference is we only turn on the auto login netboot set when we know we're re-imaging, when people aren't on campus and there's much less of a chance that they're going to automatically netboot and automatically log in and automatically start an image workflow. Workflow automation, again, this is where computers in the library, I can assign them the re-image automatically to El Capitan, our latest version of El Capitan. And here's a demo. This is the demo of the API. So you can see here that back up, slow down past me. You can see here that on a computer object, you can set the computer information for the ARD fields. But as I let my demo go, you'll notice that when you go into a computer group, that option isn't available to set en masse. So it's something you can do using the API. I can run a quick little Python script again that essentially looks at all the computers in the library and tells them to set my field 1 to testing. So I need to polish the script up a little bit before I publish it, but my hope is that essentially if you run the script, any computers that are, say, in the library group will automatically set your first field to the name of that group, making it a little easier to kind of automate without having to get in and play with the code at all. Package groups. Package groups allow you to better maintain your packages if you still use DeployStudio to install packages post-image time. It's easier to maintain workflows, and it's easier to maintain software update packages. And also, the key thing I'm trying to show off this year a little bit is it allows you to integrate AutoPKG. If you haven't heard about AutoPKG, I highly recommend trying to find a session sometime this week to get more information on it. I do have a quick demo on it, and hopefully it'll kind of persuade you to go and start using it. So there may be a few of us, especially our DeployStudio veterans, that have workflows that may look like this, where you can't really tell what's what because you have so many packages to install. If I asked any of you right now to go find me the VLC installer, what are you going to do? You're going to start here and click on each and every one until...
The other side, because alphabetically it's probably
Could be. Now, just for you, I'm going to stick it right in the middle. So all the software gets kind of jammed into one, and anytime you need to go in and update it, it's a pain, because one of the pain points of using this method is if you have a version in your package name and that version changes or the package name changes, you have to come in and actually change this value on the workflow. Kind of a pain in the butt. So one of the other options is to break out all of your software into individual software workflows, much easier to maintain. I know if I need to update Minitab, I can come into the Minitab workflow, and now there's just 2 packages. And now I can just drop this down and change this to 1.6 if I needed to. There's even a better option, though. The better option is to potentially use package groups, which using a package group I can now say that I put all of my packages for Minitab in this group here, and when I go back to the workflow, I tell it to use one single package install, and I point it to the package group. Now what that allows is back here, when Minitab updates, I just delete out this 1.5 package, drop in my 1.6 package, and do nothing else. I don't have to touch any of the workflows. I don't have to manually change the drop-downs to be the new package version.
I've never seen the groups before.
The groups, they're kind of hidden, or basically if you click, do I have a shot? I don't. If you click on packages, there's a little plus sign down at the bottom. You click that, it creates a package group.
And then where does that show up in the file system for where you need to put that?
So within the file system, within your repository, there is just a packages subfolder. A subfolder is created, and you just drop all of your packages in that subfolder.
That is sweet.
Yes.
That is work today alone.
Yes. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. So those are package groups, and this is important because of because of AutoPKG. So if we continue on just a little bit. One last slide. The ability to, again, using nested workflows. So instead of having all the software, the whole bunch of package tasks, I now can just have embedded workflows that use kind of my, Adobe CC and Minitab. That way, again, when Adobe CC updates for the billionth time, I can know which workflow to go to and modify those packages. But now, if I need to install all site licensed software, I should never have to run any other workflow. I should never have to modify this workflow. I should only ever have to modify these workflows here. And even then, you may not have, Adobe, of course, is my asterisk here, but you should never even have to really modify this workflow. At the end of the day, the only thing you should have to modify are the contents of your package groups, which again are just your file system, the subfolders within the DeployStudio repository. So AutoPKG, I want to touch on very quickly. I'm not going to go too in-depth to it, but it's an automation framework for software packaging and distribution. You run software recipes that automate the downloading of the latest version of software. There are community-developed recipes that download this latest version of the software directly to the DeployStudio packages folder or your package groups. Without getting too in-depth into AutoPKG, you have the ability to make a recipe override. And in that override, you can specify your exact path you want it to go to. That's very powerful because A, we never have, I promise you, none of us all have the same exact path to our DeployStudio repository. And B, the community-written recipes currently dump directly to the root of the packages folder, not into package groups. So you would need to make an override that just tells like VLC to dump into the package group folder versus the root of the packages in your repository. Very quick demo. Hopefully it doesn't go by too fast. You can see here that I have a VLC package group that is currently empty. I have no files in it. Push button. There it goes. If I run AutoPKG with my VLC DeployStudio recipe, it downloads the latest version of DeployStudio, dumps it into the packages group for me on the file system, and now you can see I have the latest version of VLC in that package group. So now, eventually, if you get to the point where AutoPKG is fully automated, you may never have to open DeployStudio again except for to build out the next workflow for the next OS. You can quite literally always have the latest version of the software that's available via AutoPKG available in DeployStudio for you. So that way you know that when you go and image a machine, you're getting, hopefully, the latest version of all the software that's available on the internet, causing less time to do software updates after the imaging is done. So when you hand the faculty member back their laptop, it should be as up-to-date as it can be. So, and that's using packages within DeployStudio. That's not assuming that you're using Monkey or any other patch management software after the imaging is done. AutoDMG. It's exactly how the developer wants it pronounced, as AutoDMG. It takes an OS installer, base installer, and builds a never booted core OS image. Automatically downloads the latest software updates so that the image is never booted but is also fully up to date so that there are hopefully no known security vulnerabilities in the OS when you boot it. It has the ability to add additional packages. So this is very similar to what I just showed you with packages, is rather than laying down the OS, booting the DeployStudio first run time environment and installing packages after the fact, this can allow you to actually install packages directly into the never booted image. It's kind of a hybrid of monolithic imaging, but you're not pulling down the image anymore. Now you're taking a base OS and you're taking a never booted OS and you're injecting the packages directly into it to allow for block level restoration through DeployStudio, through ASR. So it kind of saves you time in that sense. And there's I didn't put a slide for it. There's a great thing out there by Facebook, actually. They have the ability to kind of merge AutoDMG, AutoPKG, Monkey, and AutoDMG? Yes, some of those. So essentially what you can do is you can get even more hands-off and basically say, here's a Monkey manifest with all the core software I want installed, and you point it towards AutoDMG, and essentially you end up with it's a monolithic image, but it's not one that you had to like install on a machine and pull down. It's a never booted, freshly updated image that you can lay down. So I'll see if I can find that at the end if anyone's interested, but it's something that Facebook developed and released out to GitHub for us. AutoDMG also has a CLI available so that you can, if you choose to, have some kind of workflow where there's a launch daemon or some kind of cron job, whatever you want to call it, that every so often will go out and automatically build the latest version of the OS. So if you're like me, I have a file share out there that anytime there's a new version of OS 10, I download it off the App Store, bundle the .app into a disk image, and throw it out on a share so that anyone on the campus can use it, kind of like a retro caching server, if you will, so that we aren't all downloading the same 6 gig binary. So once I do that, I can say, okay, here's a workflow script that goes out and checks that folder on the share if there's a new version available, and then automatically build me a new zero boot image with AutoDMG. Here's a quick example of how. Apparently I recorded sound. Well, that's going to be fun to fix. Pardon the man behind the curtain here. Why can't I mute you? Okay.
Systematic methods that I...
Mute. Mute on. Okay. That's fun. Demo of using AutoDMG. You just drag your .app into AutoDMG. It examines it, makes sure that you have the right OS to build it on, and also finds the latest updates that are needed for that OS. You click download. It downloads all of the updates straight from Apple's servers so that they're genuine. After all the downloads are done,
The manifest to know what to download. Is that automatically updated?
Yes, 1 second. After that, you click build, you give it a location, and here is where I would recommend that you pick your masters folder, your HFS masters folder in DeployStudio. So DeployStudio masters HFS. You'll notice that AutoDMG automatically adds the required .hfs file extension that DeployStudio requires for it to show up. You elevate, and you'll see here that it actually starts creating the disk image. And fast forwards. iMovie only allows you to speed up so much. I think it's like 5,000% is what I've got this at, and it's still not fast enough. After it's done installing the base OS, you'll notice that the 4 packages, the 4 updates that it downloaded will start applying. So remote desktop client, iTunes, Safari, and the latest security update. So now you know that after this image is laid down that it has the latest security updates, and hopefully there are, again, no known vulnerabilities when you put it down on new hardware and hand it out to the wild. Build successful. You can say reveal if you want to go look at it yourself. Otherwise, just hit OK. And you're done. You now go into DeployStudio and you refresh your masters list, and there's a brand new fresh image in there. And again, the default file name for it is very informative. It tells you the build date, it tells you the OS that it built, in this case 10.10.5, so that you know which one was most recently built, and again, it'll help you sort in the list. I'm sorry, so you had a question about the where it gets the list from.
Yes.
Right.
And how frequently that's updated.
So it's community updated. It's a GitHub project, and essentially the profiles, there's a separate GitHub repository out there just for the profiles. And pretty much anytime something hits, someone in the community within, I would say an hour at most, has gone out and found the key they need to put into the profile. So it is still a manual update process. Someone somewhere still has to tell it what to pull down, but it is out on GitHub, so it's very centrally managed and eligible to, go ahead.
In terms of refreshing the masters list, short of quitting DeployStudios, is there a way to do that? Or restarting the machine? The only ways I know to get either new packages to show up necessarily, or the new masters to show up in the DeployStudio admin window, is to quit the DeployStudio, go into system preferences and quit it there, and restart it, or to restart the whole machine. Is there a third way?
No, the answer is no. So the question, because I didn't hand you the mic, the question is there are certain tabs, if you will, within DeployStudio that don't update in real time. So in this particular instance, if you add a new master into it, actually I believe masters, what's that? I believe masters does, but packages don't. And it's weird too, because packages, it'll show up in the list, but what won't show up is the little counter in the column, and it also won't tell you the file size of the package. So there are certain things that won't update. There is one other that I ran into that I can't recall right now, but there are certain things, yes, in DeployStudio that you have to at least restart the service. And that's as far as I've ever had to go, is going into the system pref pane and just off and on again, and that reboots the internal service and suddenly starts showing it in the admin interface again. So, but I do know masters is one of the few that essentially if you click like computers and then go back to masters, that's enough to refresh it. Environmental variables are another way to help automate things within the automation tool. So you can use things like model identifier, the current workflow ID, or the serial number of the machine to be able to kick off different paths of code. One of the things that many people may not know is that the serial number has a lot of embedded information in it. For example, one of the pieces of information is the last 4 characters in the new version of the format. The last 4 characters are actually a form of model identifier. So if this model identifier is not enough, if you need to actually go out and determine that, you know, my 2012 leased machines have these last 4 identifiers in the serial number, but I bought, you know, some other ones that have a slightly different model identifier in the serial number, you can, you know, use that as kind of a point of reference to know that, well, when I bought these 3 in February, they need to go in this cart, but these ones that I bought in March just happen to have a different model identifier. You can help use that as a way to determine the difference between them. There's a DS example shell script that comes with DeployStudio that lists all of the environmental variables that DeployStudio sets at runtime. So if you ever need an idea of what is set and what's available, you can just quickly run this as in a workflow, and it'll dump it all out to the logs to the screen for you. Discussions. So as I said earlier, one of the key points of this is there isn't a whole lot of new content for DeployStudio. So one of the goals is to hopefully have discussions similar to what we just had here, where if you guys have questions about DeployStudio, hopefully I or someone in the audience can answer them. We are going to try and use the catch box so that I can record what you're asking in the discussion. But these are just one last thing that I just wanted to point out is NBI Creator is another project out on GitHub that I personally have not yet had time to investigate. But my understanding of it is it helps automatically create DeployStudio netboot sets so that, again, you can further automate things that happen. So if 1.7.4 of DeployStudio is released, you could hopefully run this without you having to manually go and put it on your recent hardware and, you know, have a machine with El Capitan on it and so on and so forth. So if anyone has any experience with NBI Creator, I'd love to hear about it so that I can learn something out of this. So that, I believe, yes, so that's where we're at. So we'll start with discussions. We got a hand up here. You ready to catch?
I don't have any experience with NBI Creator, but I did a bash script to automate it, and online there's some discussion about how to do that. One of the things that I discovered, and I'm wondering if others have different experiences, is that if you're trying to create net boot sets for different OS versions than the one you're running, that it often gets confused about where to. I think what it's doing is it's not getting the proper recovery partition, and I think that's a side effect of the way the DeployStudio has a separate recovery partition image from the image for the main OS part. But in any case, you end up with a NetBoot set that is either non-functional or reduced functionality. Has anybody else seen that? Are there workarounds for that? Does this work around that? You know, et cetera.
I don't believe that when it creates the NetBoot set that it uses the captured recovery image that you would have in the DeployStudio repository. Personally, what I do is I have a dedicated machine that I know has the latest recovery that also matches my booted OS. For example, sometimes when you upgrade, you don't always upgrade the recovery partition with it. So what I do is just make sure that I have 10.11.5, both recovery and booted OS. So
You use a separate machine too.
I do use a separate machine. One of the things I have personally been thinking about playing with is trying to build it in a VM. I know others have done it. I just haven't had enough time to work on and making it work, because there's also, I believe Rich Troughton has a GitHub, what am I trying to say, project that allows you to build recovery partitions from scratch, essentially, so that you can put them on VMs and use it that way, so that it's faster with snapshotting and things like that. So that's potentially an option, but I don't know if anyone else had input. No? All right. Seeing how you've been so chatty. I got Magnets. Who wants to talk? All right, we got one over here. Oh. If you got cups with water, you may want to finish them now.
I finished my coffee before. So for the auto damage, can you? Does it have to be just a brand new, like an Apple master? Can it be your master image for your call, like for RIT, your RIT El Capitan image? Can you use auto damage to update it during the year?
Right. So you're asking if I already have a built golden master, built monolithic image, can I use that?
Yes.
My answer is I don't know. I don't ever do that workflow, and I don't know if it can support that workflow. Okay. But the premise behind auto damage is that you're always doing a thin image, never booted OS that you should never have to build upon one that's already been built before. It's kind of in the mindset of you should always be building something fresh when there's new updates, new OSs, new applications, and things like that. So, but I know that can be a bit difficult because there are people that love to include like the Office suite or the Adobe Creative Cloud suite and things like that. And I don't believe we're at a point now that auto damage supports any of those installers. So my recommendation would be for those who haven't been a part of it yet, I highly recommend going to macadmins.org and joining Slack. That is a great community resource that you will learn tons more than you could ever possibly imagine by going out and finding websites and blogs and projects for yourself. I think we're over 5,000 people in the MacAdmin community are currently signed up for this Slack channel. So macadmins.org, it'll give you a Heroku app that automatically allows you to sign up for our Slack instance. But there is a DeployStudio channel, so if you have specific questions about DeployStudio, pop in there. I'm in there all the time. Try to mention me. And the reason I bring this up for you is there's an auto damage channel in there. It'd be a great place because the developer of auto damage sits in there as well. Now, he's in Europe. I forget where in Europe, but I know he's in Europe. So he's kind of on a different time zone than the rest of us, but he's very responsive. And the other big thing is he loves I won't say loves feature requests, but he is very responsive to feature requests. So a number of feature requests he also writes Monkey Admin. So so the same guy that writes Monkey Admin writes auto damage. So if you have suggestions, put them in as issues in the issue tracker on the GitHub project. So that's my recommendation for that. Yep. Go ahead.
As far as the automated workflows, we're actually not importing any serial numbers into the computer library, but we have 30 to 50 new computers a week that we're imaging. Is there any way to automatically kick off a workflow without importing those computer IDs? I know DeployStudio doesn't offer it out of the box, but
They do and they don't. So if you have the reject unknown computers option selected, then you have to pre-import the computer and tell it what workflow you want. If you don't have that selected, then you just netboot them into automatically logged in netboot set, and you just change your default group so that it's a group that has whatever workflow you want set. So in my instance, I don't know if I have DeployStudio on here. In my instance, you would just go in and say for the library, you would make that the default group, which essentially means if there's not a computer already assigned or not already a computer in the DeployStudio computers database, it'll automatically get assigned to that group, and it'll automatically run the workflow that's assigned to that group. So there is an easy way, and I've done it tons of times. You get a pallet of 35 new iMacs for a computer lab set up. You get them all laid out on the table, and get them on your network and whatnot. And that's essentially what we do: is go around and hold the N key, and come back in 20 minutes after getting coffee, and they're all imaged and ready to go. So it is possible. Oh, you?
You successfully used that AutoDMG with 1012 Sierra beta.
I have not tried.
It was giving me an error, but I don't know if anyone has used it.
Yeah, has anyone actually tried to use DeployStudio with Mac OS 1012 Sierra? No? Okay, no brave souls? I haven't tried yet either. So the only recommendation I can give you there is use the DeployStudio forums for now, and hope that admin shows up and saves us again. We'll start with you.
Has anyone had any issues or success dual booting with a Capitan and the Fusion drives? I think I asked you about that.
Yeah, I think you asked me about this. So there is a known issue, and it's system integrity protection related, which is if you have a 1011 LCAP netboot set and you try to do an image workflow that includes a Fusion drive, it's not allowing the bless command to properly bless it. And I don't know if that's a problem that, even if it was in active development, could be fixed, because, well, I personally don't know enough about SIP and how to potentially work with SIP, but I'm fairly certain that's something that's going to be hard to fix if you're not working for Apple. So that may just be another, kind of, yeah, exactly. Maybe another reason why DeployStudio is on its way out. Hold on. You ready?
In regards to that, I mean, the netboot sets, I had the problem, the actual network netboot sets, I had problems with it actually going through and getting the bless command after trying to create the Fusion drive. But if you use the actual netboot drives, I mean, you have to actually physically go and take the drives to it, but it'll actually go through and create the Fusion drive and continue on with the workflow after that. But you actually have to have the netboot flash drives to work with that.
Good to know. Go right to him. Oh.
So my question was just touching on you saying DeployStudio being on the way out. I mean, what's your plan for, like, what's next? Just out of curiosity.
So again, I discussed this slightly at the beginning. One of my actual plans for DeployStudio itself is I'm hoping to have a good conversation with admin and see if, there's always been cries to open source DeployStudio. While that may never happen, I want to see if he'll at least pass it on, because it's very clear that he doesn't have the time to maintain it anymore. So I'm hoping that we might be able to at least have the conversation of keeping it remained closed source, but allow someone else to help with the development on it. Now, if you've ever done the about for DeployStudio, you'll see that it's not always just the DeployStudio team. There's other names that are listed as past developers. So it's clearly been kind of passed on in the past. I'm just hoping that they may allow that to happen again. One of the potential drawbacks to that is, to my knowledge, it's all written in Objective-C. And as I was mentioning earlier, I don't know Objective-C. And if I'm going to learn a new Apple programming language, it's going to be Swift, not Objective-C. So we're kind of in this weird paradigm now where if he does pass on the reins, we've got to find someone that's already familiar with Objective-C. Now, I'm not trying to sign him up for it, but the guy who wrote AutoDMG and MonkeyAdmin, I'm fairly certain that's all written in Objective-C, and I'm fairly certain he, at least at one point, was using DeployStudio. So I may be able to twist his arm a little bit to at least take a look at it. But one of the things you have to keep in mind with DeployStudio is a lot of the GUI is Objective-C, but a lot of the back-end stuff are just simple bash scripts that are taking variables from the workflows and stuff like that. So things like that are actually quite easy to update and maintain. I think someone was telling me the other day that there's an issue with the NTP right now in the latest version in 1.7.3, and literally the fix is there's a missing quote in the script. So if you go in and you manually change and add that quote back into the script, it suddenly works again. And it's silly little things like that where we can all tout open source and the community fixes it and stuff like that. But my point is that you don't necessarily need to have just one person that knows Objective-C. You also potentially just need to know someone that knows good Bash or even good Python. So that's kind of my hope, but moving that a little further, a lot of what I do with DeployStudio now is just lay down my base image. There's another open source project out there called Imager, written by Graham Gilbert, I'm fairly certain, who, she's nodding her head yes, which is kind of a, I haven't used it, so I don't know much about it, but it's an open source project to do essentially the same thing, to just lay down a base image, bootstrap it essentially with Monkey, and then let Monkey take care of your software packages and your configurations and your AD binding and things like that. So I got you two in my mind. I'll be back with stickers or magnets in a bit. Who else has hands up? Guy in the front again? Oh, no checking. Oh, there's a loft.
Yeah, got it. Okay. I'm a consultant, and I use DeployStudio in different environments, and probably some that are different than your school, so, or than schools or some of what you use. So I'm hoping that some of this might be stuff I could share that would be helpful. One of the things, if you don't know, the NetBoot sets, you can add a number of different utilities to. Oh, you can add utilities to the NetBoot sets, and that can sometimes be really handy. For example, we've purchased Smart Utility, which is a good disk diagnostic utility. And in a number of environments, it's really handy to know that the drive is good that you are going to run a workflow against. And so we can just go up and instead of selecting terminal, we can select Smart Utility. We say, oh, we got a good drive here. We got a failing drive. It's time to service the drive. Also, I'm lazy. That may not be obvious, but I don't like redoing things. And so if I'm going to use the same NetBoot set at different clients, the question is, how do I make a NetBoot set portable? Well, one of the cheats that I do is I create in DNS a bogus zone for DeployStudio, not DeployStudio.com. I'm assuming there'll never be a top-level domain of DeployStudio. So I've got server01.deploystudio, and I alias that to whatever the local server happens to be, if that makes sense. So some of those kinds of things, you do that, now you can take DeployStudio, those NetBoot sets that you created, and maybe for a school this might be handy because if you're big enough, you might have a different instance of DeployStudio running in this, if you're a university, in one school versus another school, but you might still want to be able to use the same NetBoot sets or something like that. So there are some tricks like that work. Some of the places that I have trouble are they seem to drop older machines too quickly, and that's a problem because one of my places where I use it is a volunteer activity where we refurbish donated computers. And we actually still are getting stuff in that runs 10.6, believe it or not, which is good OS. But generally, I hope that you're successful with getting it to continue. If the rumors are true, I fear the worst, mostly because there's a rumor that a certain big fruit company is actually behind DeployStudio.
Right.
And if that's the case, it's all bottom line dollars.
Yeah.
Thing. Since you're pretty adamant that this is on its way out and that it's kind of soon to be legacy, what does it do that makes you keep using it instead of moving forward with something else?
The bottom line answer to that is it's a GUI. And essentially, when it comes down to it, there are people that just aren't comfortable in a terminal window, that aren't comfortable with having to configure things in Vim or any of those instances where they're not comfortable with it being more like a Linux environment and instead a OS 10 environment where OS 10 is big about its GUI. So it's all about the GUI really, and there's a number of features in there that I still use. One of the things I didn't cover this year is the access groups. So we actually limit which Active Directory groups can see which workflows based on who logged in. So a key example there is when I have a technician log in, they literally only see the first 4 the first 4 workflows. So they have like the universal reimage, and then they have the option to manually select which OS version they want to install. But all of my package installs, all of my meta tasks, everything else that's not in that 100, 1000 group at the beginning, they don't even see it. And that's actually a huge thing for me too, because I'm not even sure that some of the other solutions out there, do AD authentication, and because they don't do AD authentication, I can't limit what they can see. So there are key features in there that I love and that work for our workflows at RIT now, and I'm not necessarily sure there's currently the code base to support similar workflows. So, and I know there's always the touted line of, well, don't change the process, don't change the technology, or however that works. But in this case, we don't really have a choice. We have to change the technology, so now we have to force the process to work with the new technology. So that is my problem, is there's a number of key features in there. Like I don't do monolithic imaging anymore. I do these base images with AutoDMG and stuff like that, but it's the utility to deliver that image that I'm using more than the ability to get an image anymore. So that, and there's also a sense of I've put 5-6 years into DeployStudio. Like I just spoke with a gentleman, I don't know if he's in here. I just spoke with a gentleman who's still running Radmine. Like, he's been running it for 20 years, and it's what he knows, so he still runs Radmine to this day. So all the power to him. I don't think he's in here, but if it works, if it's not broke, don't fix it. That's how some people look at it. And unfortunately, DeployStudio is getting broken, and we don't have anyone fixing it. But my hopes are that there's still at least the ability to band-aid it along for now. But again, I mentioned this earlier, one of my biggest fears is with the new file system in 2017, that may finally be the nail in the coffin for DeployStudio, at least from an imaging standpoint. But again, that's pretty much all I use it for now, is to get the base image out there, and then I bootstrap into Monkey, and then Monkey kind of takes care of the rest.
2 questions. You mentioned about the new file system, but wouldn't that kill some of the other systems also?
It would, the difference being the other systems are open source and actively developed. So even if the current developer of those other ones don't continue it on, it's open source on GitHub, so someone else can pick it up and run with it. So there's a gentleman behind you that had his hand up.
So if you have, from our perspective, we've been doing either setting up the system from scratch or doing the monolithic image. One of my guys, he did have DeployStudio set up. He updated it and it bricked it all over. He hasn't restored it. So going from that perspective, would you, if you were in the same position, would you be developing the imager or staying with it with not having anything in place right now? Knowing that the rumors about
Right, yeah.
1012.
I guess my thing is if he's comfortable with code, if he's comfortable with the terminal window, go with Imager, because again, that's at least open source, so that it will hopefully be updated for Mac OS 1012. If you're not using DeployStudio today, it's a tough call, because one of the things you got to keep in mind that they're basically doing N-2 on support. So for now, DeployStudio works 95% with Yosemite, 85% with LCAP, and then it may drop off for 1012. 50% for 1012, but then 1013 with the new file system, it may finally go to 0. So I can't tell you if you're not using DeployStudio today, don't use it. I don't want to tell you that, because it's still powerful today, and you can probably get at least a year or 2 of use out of it. But if you or the other guy is comfortable with code and whatnot, start learning Imager, especially if they're also comfortable with using Monkey and the other open source tools, because at that point you're not using packages, you're not using scripts, you're not using any of the other features that DeployStudio, you're literally just throwing down an image. So again, Imager should be good for that. And I can't speak too much for it, because I personally haven't moved to it yet. That's kind of on my very long to-do list for the summer. So, right behind you.
Well, you just said haven't moved to it yet. Does it look like, from your point of view, that Imager is going to be the next step?
From my point of view, yes. It looks like Imager is going to be the next imaging tool for the Mac admin community, to just lay down your base image. And that's only because it's open source and it's being actively developed, and it's it's got more hope at this point for me than DeployStudio does. Now, having said that, there has been patches to DeployStudio to kind of band-aid it and make it work with the new releases, but it's just not as frequent as we need. Like the problem that we still have with the bless command, again, I don't know if that's a problem he can fix, that the developer can fix, but there's also been lack of feedback on the forums lately from the admin. So there's, again, the writing's on the wall that he's clearly got no time as much, doesn't have as much time as he used to for DeployStudio. So, and you know, whatever the rumors may be as to who he is, where he works, and things like that may be part of it.
So it seems to be it's coming at DeployStudio from both directions. DeployStudio is not getting patched enough, and it doesn't look like he's got time to put it in.
Right, exactly. So that's really what it's coming down to. Is I think DeployStudio to this day is still a great utility. The problem is it's a stale development at this point. So I think the last really major update was when they went from, you know, RC releases to like 1.6 or whatever. So I think 2014 maybe at this point may have been like the last big update into DeployStudio. So one of the other things, sorry, I'll let you finish and then I'll go on to my, okay. One of the things I just wanted to bring up too is he did finally actually release an example task bundle. And one of the things I've, again, maybe thought of playing with is building an actual like monkey task so that you could actually just drag in a monkey task into your workflow and it sets your repo URL and, you know, a couple of the other preferences you can set with monkey. You can make them checkboxes or something like that. But that's kind of it's one of the potential opportunities with DeployStudio is because he at least gave you that framework to start adding your own tasks. And you know, if it would just continue development to be supported by the OSs, it could really just kind of grow into being this great automation platform bigger than it is because you can just kind of start piecing other things onto it.
Well, that's one of the few things that I do with DeployStudio that's outside of just an image is to drop the plist in and then to run this shellcode that just forces Monkey to on reboot.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's already there, even that functionality is even there without the task.
Yeah. In a potential recommendation, for, like, what are you using for your base image? Are you using AutoDMG? Or,
Yeah.
so, you know, you could use Rich Troutman's first time boot package or whatever that is to do something similar where you can just inject something so that the first time it boots, it just sets that plist, it sets that variable for the software URL.
Right.
So just to kind of help you get off DeployStudio, there's other options to do just that, which is, you know, lay down your base OS and bootstrap it to Monkey.
Yeah, because that's what I'm worried about is that last little bit. If DeployStudio goes south, how do you get those? There's just one or two things in there that need to be in there.
Yep. And there are other options out there for that. And AutoDMG and Rich Troutman's first time boot package, I think is the name of it, can help with that. So, and it might also be worth, again, getting on the Slack and just hopping in the DeployStudio channel because you're not the only one that has that small problem. You know, there's a lot of people now that, again, DeployStudio is just there for the base image and then Monkey takes care of the rest, or, you know, soft patch management Y takes care of the rest. So,
right.
Okay. I've got 13 minutes left. I've still got more magnets to hand out.
Right about here. Okay. You showed off some nice Python scripts doing some stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how much of what you showed off you'd be willing to make available, because one of the things I'd like to play more with is actually sticking stuff into DeployStudio, either from within a workflow or otherwise, and as well as getting stuff out of it. And don't have a lot of expertise in that, and the documentation on the site is less than wonderful.
Right.
Yeah.
So the answer is I am going to release everything that I showed today. It'll be out on GitHub, and I'll have a simple blog post that I never update, but I'll have a blog post for it, so that way you guys can see it. My recommendation to you, I didn't even put it on the slide. My website is just simply n8felton.wordpress.com, .org, whatever it is. It's a WordPress site hosted by WordPress. So I'll have a blog post out there. I'll post about it out on Twitter. Again, follow me on Twitter, and you'll see when I post that out there. I'm hoping to have it done by the end of this week. So,
with regard to the level of support, a couple of years ago when I first started using DeployStudio, actually it's probably more like 4 or 5 years ago, they had a nightly builds section on their website, and it was probably not every night, but every other night or so, there was a new posting. And that is not only gone, but actual even minor patches are now
quarterly or even 6 months or
Yeah.
something like that. They're much less frequent. They did used to clearly have a team of developers. It's not clear that they even have one full-time now, etc. So it is being de-emphasized by whoever's writing the checks.
Right. Yep. Anyone else? Any other comments, discussions, questions, anything?
I have a general question. We just started getting Fusion drives in our campus.
Sorry.
Yes. Yeah, a whole different story. But does the Fusion option in DeployStudio actually work well? Like when if you want to create from scratch?
If you're using 173 of DeployStudio and using a 1011 netboot set, no. Right. That's what's broken, is essentially SIP in your 1011 netboot set isn't allowing the bless command to boot that. But there's the option to, as he spoke earlier, there's the option to kind of use the flash drive. Someone, did he leave? Who was talking about the, yeah. I don't want to have to throw the mic again, but can you just elaborate a little bit more on the flash drive to do Fusion drives, like the flash drive netboot set?
Whenever you go through the DeployStudio manager, I think it is, there's an option down at the very end to create a DeployStudio netboot flash drive. It basically creates the same kind of netboot set that you would for booting over the network, but just on a flash drive. When you you hold down option and boot to that, it takes you into your same runtime, and you go through the workflows, and it just works. I don't know why it does.
Oh, so you're saying that if you netboot off of, or if you run the DeployStudio runtime off of a flash drive versus a netboot set, that
Correct.
the bless command works?
Yes.
Okay. I haven't tested any of this, so that's good feedback. So I have one Fusion machine that I use for testing, and because I have one, I don't do the testing. So that's good feedback, though. And one of the other things I wanted to point out, too, is they're starting to do netboot whitelisting or netboot restrictions, and you have to start whitelisting your netboot server is another thing that's coming down the pipe. So that's just another.
I know someone with a script who does that.
Yeah. So that's just another thing that's not even a fault to DeployStudio at this point. It's just a fault to netbooting in general, that it just makes it more difficult to kind of mass deploy images anymore, is because of that. So basically, no matter what, when a new machine comes in, or even your old fleet, you have to touch each and every one of them now and whitelist the IP address of your netboot server. So that one of the things to that is make sure that your netboot server is a static IP, and it's an IP you plan to have for a while, so that you're not having to change it on your fleet of computers later.
You whitelisted by a script, or you whitelisted by?
Hold on, let him go, and then.
Well, this was something separate from.
Okay, so do you whitelist by script, or do you again, not something I've played with, but my understanding of it is you have to go into like Recovery HD or some kind of externally booted OS in order to run the command to whitelist your netboot server. So it's just a pain in the butt, because now you have to, there's no way to automate it through current tools. So you have to manually touch each one and whitelist it. It is horrible, but it's Apple being more secure, so it's kind of convenience versus security.
What's the command?
No. Go ahead.
One thing to add with AutoPKG and implementing it for DeployStudio, there was a GitHub repository from JazzAce. He had a few recipes that actually, when you ran those, they could import directly into your DeployStudio packages repository.
Yep.
I never got a chance to test with it, but I still had it bookmarked for something to do later on. But just
Yeah.
as a resource for others, if
There are two repositories out there that have a number of DeployStudio recipes, and if you look at them, again, if you're familiar with AutoPKG at all, if you look at them, he has hard-coded in his path to his DeployStudio repository, to his packages folder. That's not where I put my DeployStudio. So what I actually do is a lot of my scripts that I write for just about anything, but DeployStudio in particular, is I actually put it somewhere specific, maybe on a RAID drive or an external hard drive or whatever, but then I just do a sym link to it as, whack DeployStudio. So then one of your options there would be to potentially do a make override on that recipe, and you just have to change it to the path of your DeployStudio repo. And that would be my potential recommendation, is just make your DeployStudio available at whack DeployStudio and make that as your override, because then if you have multiple clients and multiple sites, you can take the same file and just copy and paste it to wherever you need, or SCP it to wherever you need, and the path is always the same. So that was one of the things that I haven't really gotten into the AutoPKG community too much, but that was one thing I had always wanted to try and suggest, is try and use paths that aren't specific to your environment. Try to use kind of more generic paths so that there's less of a need to write override files, because then you're just causing more work for something that's supposed to make your life easier. So, but anyways, I digress. I got 6 minutes left. Anyone left? Oh, we got one over here again. Yeah. Don't think you have a good arm? Oh! Oh. Yeah, the accelerometer works great.
I had a question for logging for the first boot tasks. Have you looked at forwarding those to like a central syslog server? So like if you have deployment techs that are running into issues, you can just sort of remotely troubleshoot the issue, rather than like saving locally on that machine that might be having the issues.
Have not looked into that, but I do know that when a workflow completes, it uploads the log to the DeployStudio server, and you can view the logs on your DeployStudio server through, you can both look at it through the admin interface. Basically, you go to the computer, and there's a little icon you click, and that pops up the log, but it also dumps it into the log subfolder in your repository. So I've never looked into like dumping to a syslog or anything like that, but I do know that logging is quasi-built into DeployStudio, so long as the workflow actually completes and like it's still communicating.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so
If it doesn't complete, it doesn't.
well, I'm pretty sure as long as, like, even if it fails the workflow, but you get to the end of the workflow tasks, it'll still pump it up. The problem is if something hangs and crashes in the middle of it, then you don't get them. Right. So, okay. But I'm fairly certain the kickoff is when you get to the end of a workflow. That's when it tells it to dump the log up to the server.
Okay, gotcha.
Oop. 4 minutes left. Anything else? Well, I ended later than my friend who's doing a presentation, so I'm doing good there.
If nobody else is going to do this, I'm going to ask probably the most important question that everyone is afraid to ask.
Sure.
How did you make your Apple logo on your notebook red?
No, it's my girlfriend actually works for Apple Retail, and when they do their selling of product red products, last year when they were selling product red products for a week, anytime you bought a product red item, you got a little sticker sheet, and it's basically just a translucent Apple sticker that came from the Apple Store. So yes, I'm glad that you called it red though, because normally if you're in a dark room, the white makes it look pink. So okay, I have a couple of people that I have to reserve a few of these for because they spoke. If you want a magnet, come get it. Thank you.